So let's take a look at pockets. What happens when we want to start adding functionality to our garments? This sample will require 4 patterns, all cut from muslin. The slash pocket front garment pattern, slash pocket back garment, the slash pocket top pocket bag, and the slash pocket bottom pocket bag. To begin with, I'm going to take the pocket bag pieces and set those aside. And I'm going to work with the front and back garment pieces. Do note that all 4 patterns have notches, tailor's tacks on these 2 patterns, and seam lines to be transferred. Make sure you're transferring all of your information to the opposite side of the fabric. So when you lay your patterns directly on your muslin, make sure you're transferring all those marks with chalk, because we want to make sure that where we sew our darts is going to be on the wrong side of the fabric. When you cut patterns, you place your fabric right side up and then place your patterns on top of those right side up as well. So if I were working with a printed pattern, this would be the right side of my muslin and this would be the wrong side. So on the wrong sides of my garments, I'm going to copy my tailor's tacks, those little points on my tailor's tacks. I can see where they are, where those little marks are, where my tailor's tacks were. Over here and over here. I've done one really quick tailor tack on both of these, where I just go in and out. So I've done just really quick tailor's tacks where I'm going in and out of the pattern and the muslin and just pulled my needle through and left some tails on one end and then trimmed the other tails on the other end. So this is a quick way of making a tailor's tack through a single layer of fabric. Just go in and out one time, leave tails at the beginning and at the end, and then you can easily remove them. You don't have to worry about the double tailor's tacks. The double tailor's tacks, where you take 2 stitches and leave a loop, as I showed you all before, is really good when you're working with symmetrical patterns. If I had a full skirt pattern here and I was sewing my darts, I could fold my skirt pattern together along the center back, align where my dart points were, sew my tailor's tacks through both layers of fabric and patterns, and get the same tailor's tack on both pieces. So it works really well. The 2 tailor's tack stitches with the loop is great for going through 2 or more layers of fabric. But a single layer of fabric, we can just take 1 little stitch. Now that I've transferred these marks to the wrong sides of my patterns, I'm going to remove my tailor's tacks and I'm going to remove my patterns. So removing my patterns, I can just slide that out. And if I'm happy with where my mark is on the wrong side, I'm going to take my tailor's tack out as well. Make sure I keep the wrong side of my fabric facing up. I do have my seam lines marked on here with chalk transfer paper, chalk-based transfer paper. Lift off my pattern, remove my tailor's tack. Make sure I've got that marked, and then remove my tailor's tack. And then I will mark out my dart legs, aligning my ruler to my notch. One edge of my ruler at my notch, the other at my dart point. Same thing over here. And I'll do the same to my front pattern, front garment pattern, aligning my ruler to my notch and drawing a line to that dart point. And now I've got my darts. Make sure your patterns look like this, where the slash is on this side and the curved edge is on this side. This will ensure that you're placing your darts on the correct side of the pattern. Just as we did with the 3-point dart, I'm going to fold my darts up towards me, folding along the center, aligning my notches, pinning in place. Pinning across my stitching line. Testing to make sure that my darts are properly aligned from one side to the other. Yep. And the same thing over here on my back pattern. I'm going to use 2 pins because this is a fairly long dart to make sure everything is lined up, that my 2 dart legs are equal on both sides. I'll go to my sewing machine and sew these darts, and then to my iron to press them flat. Making sure I'm sewing on a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning. Stitch off at my dart point, stitch off a few stitches, make sure my take-up lever is up, lift my presser feet, remove my work, clip my threads, leaving tails, because I will tie these into a knot at the base of my dart. I'll do the same for this pattern, my front pattern with the shorter dart. Back tack at the notch. Stitch off of the edge a few stitches, raise my take-up lever, raise my presser foot, remove my work, leave threads at the end, and trim these threads at my start. I'll take these to the iron and press these into place. So over here at my ironing board, I've got this piece. This is my front garment pattern. I know it's my front garment pattern because this is where my slash has been taken out to make room for my slash pocket. Now, you're going to see this later on when we work on the skirt, but for right now, just trust me. Know that this slash goes to the side seam. So this goes to the side of the body. And remember, when we do darts, we always push this excess towards the center of the body. We wouldn't want to push it out this way because that's going to the side of the body. This goes towards our center. So again, I've got the wrong side of my fabric. I can see all my dart excess hanging out up here. Got my tailor's ham because I'm pressing a curve, and I'm going to press all that excess in this direction. There we go. Excess pressed away from the side seam towards the center of the body. I'll do the same on this sample. This is the back of our garment. Again, the curved side is our side seam, and the straight side of our sample goes towards the center of the body. So again, I'll place my sample wrong side up, press all my excess towards the straight side of our sample, which goes towards the center of the body. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and take my little thread tails, separate them, and then tie them into a couple of square knots to secure them. Pressing this will also get rid of any friction pen marks, so we can have a nice clean sample. Just going to do 2 little square knots and trim, leaving about 1/2 inch of tails. And those are my darts done on my front and my back sample. I'm going to head back to the work table to pin some more pieces together. All right, back at the work table, here are my 2 samples. My shorter dart with the slash is my front sample. my longer dart with the curved side is the back of my sample. We're going to work with the back a little bit later, but let's go ahead and install our pocket to the front. Now this is the wrong side of my sample, and I want to be sewing with right sides together. Again, our excess goes towards the body, so this would be on the inside of my garment. So I'm going to turn this right side up so I can see a nice clean finish to my dart. I shouldn't see any dart excess. And I'm going to start by working with this pattern here, the top pocket bag. Make sure you've got your notches clipped and you've copied the seam line, the dashed line. I'm going to remove my pattern. Set my pattern aside. And you'll notice there's a similarity between these two patterns. So I want to place this pattern on top of this one so that these edges match. Now the way this particular pattern has been drafted for the sample book, this is actually the wrong side of the pattern, and this would be the right side of your pattern. If I try to flip this over this way, I can't really get this edge to match. So have your two patterns in this orientation. This is your front pattern with the shorter dart and the slash. This is your top pocket bag with a corresponding slash. Take your top pocket bag and lay it directly on top of this, and you should see those two edges match up, and your side seams match up, and your waistline match up. That would be the waistline of a pair of trousers or a skirt. Make sure you're aligning that raw edge, the two raw edges along this slash, and I'm going to pin along this edge. I'm going to end up sewing this, and if you're not sure how much we're sewing, you can always look back at your pattern. This is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is fairly standard. You can mark your seam allowance with transfer paper, chalk, friction pen. I'm actually going to start utilizing my seam guide on my sewing machine because not having to mark your patterns drastically speeds up your efficiency when you're sewing. So I'm going to utilize the seam guides on my sewing machine to allow me to sew just this seam, just along this slashed edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I still have notches that should be aligned up here at the top, and that also indicates a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to head back to my machine and get my machine set up so that I can sew these together. Remember, the right side of our front garment is still facing up, and we've aligned this slashed edge. So here at my sewing machine, I have some guidelines, as I mentioned in my Sewing Machines 101 video, but I don't have a specific guideline that identifies 1/2 inch. I've got a lot of metric marks on mine. Yours will have, the industrial Juki machines will have a 1/2 inch guideline that you can utilize, and you can just place the edge of your fabric along that 1/2 inch guideline. But I don't have that, so I'm going to use my ruler. I'm going to align that to the center of my presser foot so I can see where this 1/2 inch mark is. It's lined up to where my needle would descend into the needle plate. And I've got this little doodad here. This is a magnetic seam guide. You place the flat edge of this where you want your seams to go. So I'm going to line this and just butt it up against the edge of my ruler. So now anytime I place my fabric into this machine, it will automatically feed the raw edge along the side of my seam guide, and I can ensure that I'm sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I've got my sample here. Again, I'm just sewing along this slashed edge, starting at this notch, sewing on a number 2 seam. Place that in there, and you can see I'm just butting up my raw edges there. 2 stitches forward to just 2 stitches back, back tack my work, and stitch all along that edge. Stitch all the way through this slashed seam and back tack at the end. Raise your take up lever, raise your foot, remove your work, trim your threads. So we should have this slashed edge stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's the only part that we're sewing together to begin with. And again, it is right sides together because that's the right side of our dart. I'm going to take this to the iron and press this open. So back at the iron, this is what we've got so far. Our slashed edge stitched at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, right sides together. I'm now going to press this seam open. Going to take both pieces, open them up. If you find it easier to press this on the tailor's block, you can, so you can avoid pressing back into your dart. I'm just going to press this seam open. Pressing your seams open ensures that you have a nice clean finish from the right side, that it's a nice clean pressed seam from the right side. Now that I have this pressed open, here's the right side of it. Nice and clean pressed on the right side. I am going to take my pocket bag, the one that has the drastic curve and the one that does not have a dart, and I'm going to push this underneath my front sample, the front garment sample. So now here's my front with the dart in it, and I've just turned my pocket bag underneath. So again, here the seam is pressed open. I'm going to take the pocket bag, the one with the dramatic curve and no dart, and tuck that underneath my front sample. So what we've done by sewing this pocket bag to this slashed edge, we've clean finished this edge. It had been a raw piece of fabric, and now we've clean finished it by placing another piece of fabric underneath it. And now we have a nice clean seam. This is the start of what's called adding facings to your garments. A facing is another piece of fabric that gets added to a raw edge in order to clean finish it. So we've added both a pocket bag, which is part of the pocket that we use to put our hands in, but we've also attached a facing. It also serves as a facing to clean finish this edge. I'm going to press this briefly just so I can get that seam right there on that fold. I shouldn't see the seam rolling out towards the front or towards the pocket bag or anything like that. It should be pressed right on that fold to give me a nice clean finish. Now, there's a few ways to keep this pressed seam in place. You can top stitch through it, which is a really quick and easy way to do it, but we are going to do something called an understitch. Understitching is a really good way of keeping your facings from rolling out towards the front of your garment. Let's assume my garment is made of a white fabric and maybe my pocket bag and my facing is made of a black fabric, and I don't want to see that black fabric peeking out from around my slash pocket. So to keep that black fabric, keep my facing inside of the garment, I can top stitch everything together and have the stitches hold everything in place, or I can do some understitching. So I'll show you how we go about doing that first. What I'm going to do, we do have to make sure everything's pressed open, tucked under, and then pressed again. And now we're going to understitch. I'm going to take the front of my garment and move this out of the way. And you should see both seam allowances pressed together. They should be close to one another. And we want to push all those seam allowances towards the pocket bag, towards our facing. And what we're going to do, I'm just going to flip this over. I'm going to keep this nice and pretty. What we're going to do is we're going to stitch just alongside that seam through the facing, in this case our pocket bag, and through both layers of seam allowance. So once you have this pressed in place, you can open this back up. Make sure all your seam allowance is going towards your pocket bag. That's the one without the dart. You can hold these in place, just pinch it with your fingers. And you can turn everything right side out so you can see everything nice and clean, nice and clear. And you should have your pocket bag to one side and both seam allowances should be laying underneath there. I'm going to take this back to the sewing machine with everything held in place, and we're going to do the understitching. Back at the machine, here's the front of my garment with my dart. Here's my pocket bag on this side without my dart. And underneath here you'll find 1 and 2 layers of seam allowance. So I want all my seam allowance going towards my pocket bag. I'm going to top stitch through everything, through my pocket bag and my 2 layers of seam allowance, but I want to align my fabric so that this fold that I just created from that seam rests just along the inner edge of my leftmost toe. That way I know that when I'm stitching, I'm going to stitch just to the right of this fold, and I'll be stitching about a 1/16 of an inch away from it, creating a nice clean top stitch through all my layers. I'm going to back tack at the beginning on a number 2 stitch, and then again keeping this seam where I just pressed everything nice and neat right up along that inner edge of my leftmost toe. I'm going to top stitch through my pocket bag and both seam allowances. Back stitch at the end just to secure my stitches. Take up lever all the way up, lift the presser foot, remove your work, clip your threads. So there is my understitching. It's called understitching because it's not seen from the top of the fabric. Here's the outside of my garment with my dart, and this would be the slashed edge along my pocket. You can't see that stitching when the pocket bag is tucked inside, but it is there. It's going through my pocket bag and both layers of seam allowance. You can see underneath here. Here is my original seam. And just beside it is my bobbin stitch from my understitching. Again, a 1/16 of an inch away is an ideal placement for your understitching or top stitching. Back tacked at the beginning and back tacked at the end. I'm going to head back to my workstation and add the next piece. So back at the workstation, here's what the front of my garment is looking like. Here's the right side of my garment with my dart excess underneath. Under there, pressed towards my center front. Here's the slash for my slashed pocket, and right underneath here is my understitching in a contrast thread so you can see that. Understitching is a nice little sneaky way that we can control facings to keep them from rolling out towards the front of the garment, and no one who doesn't know that there's understitching would know that there was anything under there from looking at the front of the garment. Next pattern piece I'm going to use is the bottom pocket bag. Make sure you've got all the notches marked on here, clipped on here, and your stitching line copied. Again, this is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Notice that there is a seam allowance on this pocket bag. Seam allowance is only here and here around this edge. This edge, however, does not have a seam allowance around this curved section. You may see some patterns with a seam allowance there, but this is a deep enough pocket that we don't really need to add any extra seam allowance down there. So here is the rest of my pocket bag. So you might notice, just as we had corresponding slashes on the last 2 patterns, we now have corresponding curves on these 2 patterns, and these are going to go together again. So I've got my new pattern on my right, my combined patterns on my left. I'm going to pick up these patterns from the left and just place them on top of the patterns on the right. Now suddenly Once you align these curved edges under here, you might start to see a familiar curve along our side seams. These side seam curves should be mirror images of each other. So once you place the right sides together, there's the rest of our side seam. So anytime you're working on a slashed pocket, you always slash out part of the side seam at the front of your garment, and the rest of that side seam is made up by the bottom pocket bag. So again, here's my front garment with my top pocket bag attached and understitched. Here's that curve that matches the curve of my bottom pocket bag. Pick this piece up, lay that on top, align my curved edges under here. And now I've completed the side seam for my skirt or trousers. These could be trousers as well. You should find a notch down here on your front garment piece that should align pretty closely to where the raw edges of the pocket bags are. May not be perfect, especially since we did some understitching, but just so you have an idea to make sure you're not offsetting these pocket bags in some strange manner, make sure you just have those curves matching. So I'm gonna just kind of set my front garment out of the way. And I'm gonna pin this edge together. I'm gonna turn everything this way just because, again, I like to keep this raw edge nice and flat so I can stitch along here and have all my excess fabric going out over there. So that's the front of my garment. There's my understitching. I just took this whole thing and flipped it over just so I can sew along that curve without things getting in the way. Now, there is no seam allowance marked on this, but I will stitch it at a 1/2 inch seam allowance just to hold everything together. There are a variety of ways of finishing off this bottom pocket edge. I am going to stitch mine at a 1/2 inch seam allowance on my machine, and then I will serge everything together. I will serge the two edges together to prevent fraying. You can do a French seam on this curve. You can put both of the pocket bag pieces wrong sides together, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, press it, turn it, trim it, and then stitch again at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That's a very common way for menswear to have the bottom edge of the pocket bag finished. You can also do a bias bind around the edge if you rather finish that off to prevent any fraying. I'm just going to stitch mine at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then serge it to prevent fraying. Now, if you don't have a seam guide like this, which I don't expect you to, make sure you are marking your seam allowance, whether you want that to be a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch, or whichever. And then you can use that line as your guideline as you go around that curve. Up until now, we've really been doing straight seams, but curving your seams is also something you can do. So it may help to mark out where this curve is by measuring a 1/2 inch in from your raw edge so you know where you're stitching. I'm going to take this to my serger and serge that raw edge, and then I'll head back over to the work table. So there is my stitch from the sewing machine. As I mentioned, if you don't have a seam guide, you can use your ruler. Line up the 1/2 inch mark on your ruler. That's 4 little squares on this clear ruler. Line up the 1/2 inch mark with the raw edge of your fabric, and then mark on the edge of your ruler and work your way in sections around that raw edge. And you'll see that you'll be marking at a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. So you can use that as your guide as you're stitching. And then I've serged along this edge just to prevent fraying, and I've serged through both sides, both layers of fabric. So I can now tuck my pocket bag up underneath. Here's the front of my garment. If this were a pair of pants or a trousers or a skirt or something, you'd have more fabric that would cover up the rest of the pocket bag here. So now I've got this tucked up underneath. Next thing I want to do is kind of lock everything down because we've got a lot of loose fabric coming loose here. It can just accordion its way out. So I'm going to pin along this upper edge through all of these layers. And the same thing down here along this edge where we've got 3 layers of fabric. I'm going to pin through this on the side seam. And I'm going to head back to my machine, switch to a number 4 stitch, a machine basting stitch. And I'm going to sew just inside of my seam allowance. We know that we're working with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on here and here. And I'm going to sew just inside of that at about 3/8 of an inch. So I will mark my fabric to help myself out using the raw edge of my fabric lined up with 1, 2, 3 of those little squares and mark along here. That's about 3/8 of an inch. So now I know where that line is. I'll do the same up here on my waistline. 1, 2, and 3 of those little squares. Work my way around that curve, pivoting my ruler as I go. So I have some lines there to mark out where I should be stitching. So I'll go to my machine, switch to a number 4 stitch, no back tacking, and just stitch across here to make sure this gets secured. I'll start here and then stitch off in this direction. Same thing here. I'll start up here and stitch down in this direction. Back of the machine, switching to a number 4 stitch. Stitching across this top of my sample. This would be where my waistline would go. No back tack. Stitching through all my layers, making sure my dart is going in the correct direction. And I can just machine baste that in place. Make sure my uptake lever is up. Lift my presser foot, remove my work, clip my threads. I'm going to clip my serge stitches as well. There's my basting. Again, 3/8 of an inch. That way I don't need to remove this basting if I am sewing this to another piece of my garment, because my stitching would, my actual seam would go at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and everything else would be hidden inside of that seam. And do the same over here. Stitch at 3/8, making sure I cover my stitches over this slashed edge, because I want to make sure that doesn't lift on me. There we go. Take up lever all the way up, lift the presser foot, remove the work, clip the threads. So again, that takes care of the side seam, and if I were to sew this, which I'm about to do, I'm going to sew this side seam to the back of my garment. We're going to end up stitching along here, and you won't be able to see those basting stitches when we're done. I'll head back to the work table and finish up pinning this. So back at the work table, I've got my basting stitches, machine basting stitches in place. I'm going to get my back of my garment. Again, this has the long dart. This is the right side. I've got the dart excess on the wrong side. I'm going to take my 2 side seams and place my pieces right sides together, matching up this side seam, pinning it in place. Pinning perpendicular to my stitching line. Pinning through all of the layers. It's going to get a little bit thick. We've got almost 4 layers of fabric that we're pinning through. And then again, I'll go back to the machine, stitch this at a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. Number 2 stitch, make sure to switch back to a number 2 stitch. Back tack at the beginning. And stitch along that curved side seam, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And back tack at the end. Uptake lever all the way up, lift your presser foot, remove your work, clip your threads. So there is my side seam, back tacked at the beginning and at the end through all of the layers. As I mentioned, there's our machine basting that we just did inside of the seam allowance. So I open the seam up, there's the machine basting. And from the outside, if I lift this up, you cannot see that machine basting. It's stuck inside of the seam, no one would know it was there. Saves us time having to pick any stitching, any hand basting or machine basting out. I'm going to go to the ironing board and finish up this sample. Now because I'm pressing a curve, I'm going to get my tailor's ham again. We're going to open our work. We can see nice clean finishes. Here's the front of our garment, the back of our garment. I'm going to place this wrong sides down over my tailor's ham so I have a nice curved surface to work from. And what'll happen, I'm going to start pressing my seam open at the top of my sample. But as I get down here, where I have about 3 or 4 layers of fabric, I'm just going to press that towards the back of my garment. That's the natural direction that all of these layers want to go in. I don't want to try to force all of these layers of fabric to press open, so I'm just going to press everything towards the back. So our seam will go in a couple of different directions. This will be pressed open up here. And as I get down here, where I've got all these extra layers, I'm just going to press everything towards the back. Again, kind of tugging my fabric as I go to make sure I've got a nice clean finish underneath. And you can see our seam allowance from our front just kind of twists as it goes towards the back. Perfectly fine. You'll see this kind of pressing done on a lot of denim wear, where the seam allowance just gets pressed in 2 different directions. So here is our finished slash pocket sample. Here's the front of the garment, our side seam, and the back of the garment. There's our pocket bag underneath. The pocket bag for your slash pocket will always go towards the front of the body. And you can see under here is our understitching. There is our pocket bag. You can slide your hand inside. And there is our pocket bag completed. I will label this as my slash pocket. And we're done.